quiet neighborhood, the kind where nothing ever seemed out of place. But on that night, silence was broken, not by the hum of traffic or the bark of a distant dog, but by a single piercing scream. It echoed to the narrow streets, bounced off empty walls, and sent a chill down every spine within earshot. No one knew then that the source of that scream was a child, and no one imagined that the hands responsible for what followed might belong to the very person sworn to protect her. This is not just a crime story. This is a journey into the deepest, darkest corners of a mother's mind. A tale of love so overwhelming it borders on madness. A case that baffled investigators, left psychiatrists divided, and forced a community to ask a haunting question. When does love become dangerous? Welcome to Crime Chronicles Confidential. In this extended and deeply investigative video, we dive into a real-life case that shook the very foundation of what we believe about motherhood. A case where love, grief, trauma, and obsession collided to create a tragedy that no one saw coming. Is this the story of a mother pushed beyond the brink by pain? Or is it the calculated madness of someone who confused control with care? Prepare yourself for a harrowing descent into a story where every truth hides a deeper lie, and every answer leads to a darker question. The clock had just struck 2:13 a.m. The world outside was asleep, wrapped in darkness and silence. But inside that modest two-bedroom home, something unspeakable was unraveling. A scream, sharp, desperate, and chilling, ripped through the night like a knife through still water. It wasn't the kind of scream born from a nightmare. It was real, raw, terrified. A neighbor stirred, glanced at the ceiling, then froze. Was it the television? A dream? Or something worse? Across the street, a dog began to howl, low, mournful, and steady, as if sensing what no one else could. Inside the house, a child's cry was abruptly cut off. The lights remained off. No footsteps, no voices. Just silence again, heavy, unnatural, as though the house itself was holding its breath. By the time the first neighbor dared to step outside, the scream had long faded, but something hung in the air, thick, electric, and wrong. Something had happened, and it had just begun. The following morning, everything appeared deceptively normal. The sun rose, casting golden light on the quiet street. Children headed to school, shopkeepers unlocked their doors, and the world moved on, unaware that behind one door, time had stopped. It was nearly noon when the first knock came. A relative, concerned after unanswered calls and messages, stood outside the house. The door was shut tight, curtains drawn, no movement. The relative knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Eventually, with growing unease, the neighbor from across the street stepped over. "She never sleeps in this late," they said, "and the little one's usually out playing by now." Together, they tried the handle. Locked. They circled to the back. Same result. That's when the neighbor called the police. When officers arrived, they too were struck by the stillness. No one responded to their presence. No footsteps inside. No signs of life. With legal permission and rising concern, the lock was forced open. And then came the first revelation. The house was cold. Not from temperature, but from something deeper. The air was heavy, thick with the stench of something unnatural. The living room looked untouched. But as the officer stepped farther in, the silence became louder. And then, in the small bedroom down the hall, the truth started to unfold. There, on the floor, lay a child, motionless, pale, her tiny frame curled in a fetal position, her hands clutched tightly to a blanket soaked in dry blood. Beside her sat the mother, not crying, not screaming, just staring at nothing. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, stained dark. Her eyes were wide open but vacant, as if her soul had vacated long before anyone entered the room. There was no forced entry, no signs of struggle from an intruder. Everything inside the house spoke of a quiet night, too quiet. But the scene in that bedroom told a story far more horrifying than anyone outside could have imagined, and it was only the beginning. The officer stood frozen for a moment, taking in the chilling scene before them. Training kicked in, but even experience couldn't numb the emotional punch. One officer moved toward the child, checking for vital signs. The other approached the mother slowly, voice steady but cautious. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" No response, just that same blank stare. The room looked like a war zone, yet oddly intimate. Toys scattered on the floor, picture frames knocked over, a chair on its side. The bed sheets were tangled, partially hanging off the mattress. One wall had faint scratch marks near the door. A diary lay open on the desk, pages torn and smeared. But it wasn't the mess that disturbed the officers. It was the contradiction. Despite the chaos, there was no sign of a break-in. No footprints, no broken glass, no indication of a stranger's presence. Everything broken in that room felt internal. The child was confirmed deceased. No pulse, no breath, just a soft, lingering warmth on her skin that suggested she hadn't been gone long. A paramedic later whispered, "She might have passed within the last few hours." It wasn't instant. The mother still hadn't moved. She wasn't hysterical. She wasn't even present. It was as though her mind had disconnected from her body. One officer glanced around, muttering, "This doesn't look like rage. This looks personal." A photo frame lay shattered beside the bed, mother and daughter smiling in a park, sunlight pouring through trees. The irony was unbearable. Everything in that room seemed to scream a single question. What happened here? What made a mother cross the line between love and destruction? And why did it feel like, despite the body, despite the silence, the real crime hadn't even been discovered yet? Word of the tragedy spread quickly. Within hours, the quiet street turned into a flurry of whispers, flashing lights, and curious eyes peering through half-open windows. The neighbors gathered in clumps, arms folded, voices low, as if even now they feared speaking too loudly. "I heard a scream," one woman said, clutching her shawl tighter, "around 2 in the morning, but I thought it was a dream, or a cat maybe." Another shook his head. "She's always been a bit off. Not dangerous, just quiet, reserved. You'd wave, and she'd barely nod. But who would have imagined this?" Then came the more unsettling admissions. There were signs. A man in his 50s said, "The little girl, she stopped coming out to play a while back. We thought maybe she was sick. But then I saw her once at the window, just standing, not moving, just staring." Others recalled hearing muffled arguments. A few remembered the girl crying late at night. One neighbor said he once saw the mother talking to herself in the garden, pacing for hours. But no one said anything. "We didn't want to interfere," one woman confessed. "It's a personal matter, right? We all have problems." Another added, "You never think it'll come to this. You just assume people are managing." The truth was uncomfortable. The signs had been there. Subtle, easy to dismiss, but there. And now, standing behind police tape and reporters, they couldn't help but wonder if someone had spoken up, if someone had checked in. Could this have been prevented? Regret hung heavier than the summer heat. In the end, it wasn't just a mother who failed that child. It was everyone. The investigators didn't waste time. After securing the scene and notifying child services, they brought the mother in for questioning. She was calm, almost eerily so. No tears, no panic, just silence, until they asked the first direct question. "What happened last night?" She blinked, once, twice, then whispered she was in pain. "I had to make it stop." The room went still. "What kind of pain?" one officer asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she looked at the wall, unfocused. They told me she wasn't real. But I knew she was. I saw her. I felt her breathing. She used to sing to me. The lead investigator leaned forward. "Who told you she wasn't real?" She laughed softly. A dry, hollow sound. "The voices. But they lied. She was mine." The officers exchanged glances. What started as a possible domestic violence case was rapidly shifting into something far more complex and darker. The mother spoke in fragments. About lullabies that weren't sung. About nights where she couldn't sleep because the shadows were whispering. She mentioned a second version of her daughter who would smile at night with eyes that weren't hers. Nothing she said made sense. And yet, It felt terrifyingly honest. They showed her the family photos, asked her to talk about memories. She responded robotically, reciting birthdays, favorite colors, bedtime routines, then paused mid-sentence and said, "But that wasn't her. The one in the bed wasn't mine." She took her place. The officers realized they weren't just dealing with a grieving mother. They were facing a possible psychiatric emergency. But then came the real dilemma. Was she mentally ill and delusional? Or was she carefully building a story, a shield behind which she could hide from guilt? Her words were confusing, contradictory, but they were also consistent, which made it even harder to tell. Was she telling the truth as she believed it? Or was this a dangerous act of manipulation, cold, calculated, and deeply convincing? As investigators dug deeper, they began piecing together the family's history. Social workers were brought in, relatives were questioned, school records were reviewed, and slowly, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. This wasn't the first time someone had noticed something unusual. Teachers recalled moments when a little girl arrived at school withdrawn, unusually quiet for her age. She often flinched when touched unexpectedly. Her drawings were vivid, often dark. Houses with no windows, mothers with eyes like storms. When asked what they meant, she simply said, "That's what home looks like." Neighbors mentioned hearing odd sounds at night, soft murmurs, loud thuds, sudden shouts followed by silence. No one had reported anything. They thought it was just stress, or maybe a private family matter best left alone. A babysitter, who only came once, never returned. She told a friend the mother had stared at her for long stretches without blinking, whispering to herself when she thought no one was listening. "There's something off in that house," she had said. "Too much love, or maybe not the right kind." When relatives were questioned, they admitted the mother had grown increasingly possessive. The child wasn't allowed to play outside alone. No sleepovers, no visits, no birthdays outside the home. She said the world was dirty. One cousin said that she had to protect her, but protection turned into isolation. Love turned into surveillance. And beneath it all, fear had quietly grown like mold in the walls, unseen but suffocating. The child had lived in a world of contradiction, held too tightly to be free, loved too fiercely to feel safe. Every moment shaped not just by affection, but by instability. She wasn't raised in a home. She was raised in a shadow, where hugs could turn to panic, lullabies to whispers, and love to something terrifying. The mother's past, once thought to be unremarkable, began unraveling under the microscope of investigation. It didn't take long to see that the seeds of this tragedy had been planted long before a child ever took her first breath. She was the youngest of 3 sisters, born into a household marked by silence and strictness. Her father was distant, physically present but emotionally absent. Her mother, overwhelmed and often ill, depended heavily on her for support. From a young age, she learned that emotions were burdens, not expressions. Crying was weakness. Talking back was rebellion. Affection was conditional. By her teenage years, she was already showing signs of dissociation. She kept a diary, its pages filled with entries not about her life, but about imagined ones, versions of herself who were loved, protected, seen. In college, she had few friends. Professors described her as intelligent but withdrawn. She always sat near the exit, one recalled, like she was never planning to stay. Her only known romantic relationship ended abruptly after miscarriage, a loss she never spoke about but never seemed to recover from. She disappeared for months afterward, resurfacing changed, detached, obsessed with the idea of motherhood. When she eventually had her daughter, everything in her world revolved around that child. She left her job, cut off friends, moved twice in the span of 1 year. Her life became a fortress with one fragile center, the little girl. But history has a cruel habit of repeating itself when left unresolved. The same emotional distance she once suffered as a child twisted into overattachment. The same silence she was raised and transformed into paranoia. The rejection she once felt hardened into control. She wasn't just raising a daughter. She was trying to rewrite her own childhood, to heal herself through someone else. But in doing so, she unknowingly passed down the very chain she once fought to escape. And when the past remained unspoken, untreated, and unresolved, the present shattered under its weight. The forensics team moved methodically, scanning every inch of the small bedroom, documenting every trace left behind. What they found painted a picture more disturbing than any confession, more honest than any witness. Because a body never lies. The child's injuries were precise, not chaotic, not impulsive. They were deliberate. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle, which meant she didn't fight back. Either she trusted the person who harmed her, or she never saw it coming. Toxicology reports revealed no drugs or sedatives in her system. She had been fully conscious, aware, awake. There were faint bruises on her arms, days old, not fresh, not from a single incident, but consistent with being gripped too tightly, often, possibly over weeks. A silent pattern of pain that had never been voiced, only endured. The mother's fingerprints were found on the child's shoulders, wrists, and neck. The pressure patterns told their own story, not one of sudden rage, but of prolonged contact. Enough to leave marks, not enough to kill. The cause of death, however, was asphyxiation. Slow, controlled, terrifying. There was no sign of external trauma, no weapon, just the horrifying suggestion that this was done with bare hands. On the bedsheets, strands of the mother's hair, torn at the root. On the mirror, a single smudge shaped like a child's hand. And beneath the bed, tucked away and half-burned, a torn drawing. Crayon lines showed a figure inside a cage. The figure wasn't crying. It had no mouth. The forensics didn't explain motive, but they proved one thing beyond doubt. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't self-defense. It wasn't mistake in the dark. It was a moment, chosen, carried out in silence. And the evidence, cold and quiet, told the truth the mother wouldn't or couldn't say aloud. When investigators accessed the mother's phone, they expected the usual, calls, messages, maybe internet searches. What they found instead was a descent into obsession. Her recent search history was filled with disturbing queries. How to know if your child is possessed, signs your child has been replaced, spiritual protection from mothers, voices in my head or intuition. The frequency was alarming. Dozens of searches per day, some repeated every few hours, as if she were looking for confirmation, not information. Her message threads were minimal. She had slowly withdrawn from friends and family over time, and most conversations were one-sided, ending in her asking strange questions or making cryptic statements. I think she's not really mine anymore. Do you ever feel like your child is watching you, not the other way around? Something is wrong. I can feel it in her eyes. Then came the voice memos. She had been recording herself, sometimes at night, sometimes while humming lullabies in the dark. One recording was over 10 minutes long. She whispered to herself, asking invisible forces to return her real daughter. In another, she spoke as if talking to a child. You're not fooling me. I know what you are. Bring her back. Even more unsettling was a private folder on her phone labeled Light. Inside were videos, some showing her daughter sleeping, others just minutes of her staring at the child in silence. No movement, no sound, just observation. One final video, taken the night of the incident, was incomplete. It showed the child lying in bed, eyes half open. The mother was sitting beside her, whispering something unintelligible. The video ended abruptly after a faint shift in the camera, perhaps dropped, or intentionally stopped altogether. The phone revealed what no one around her had noticed, a mind spiraling out of control, isolated, paranoid, and consumed by delusions. She hadn't planned a crime in the traditional sense. She had documented a collapse. One keystroke, one voice memo, one whispered warning at a time. And in the end, her phone didn't just provide evidence. It preserved the ghost of her unraveling. Psychiatrists were brought in immediately after the initial interviews. The mother's behavior raised too many red flags: detachment, delusions, emotional flatness, and a strange mix of calmness and confusion. Within days, she underwent a full psychological evaluation under supervised observation. The diagnosis was not simple. She displayed symptoms of paranoid delusions, visual hallucinations, and a distorted perception of reality. Her speech patterns were coherent, but often circled back to the same themes: protection, danger, and the belief that her daughter had somehow been replaced. She repeatedly insisted that something was inside her child, something not human. When asked why she didn't seek help, she responded, "No one would have believed me. They never do." She was assessed for postpartum psychosis, though her daughter was no longer an infant, but the records showed she'd never received mental health care during or after pregnancy. There had been no screenings, no follow-ups, no intervention, nothing. Her deterioration had gone unnoticed, or worse, ignored. Further evaluation suggests a severe and untreated case of schizoaffective disorder, complicated by a deep-rooted trauma history and extreme emotional dependence on her daughter. Experts noted that her maternal instincts hadn't disappeared. They had mutated. What should have been nurturing became possessive. What should have been protective became destructive. One report described it perfectly. Her love became a shield so thick it turned into a cage. But not all experts agreed. Some believed her state might be exaggerated, a way to escape accountability. After all, her accounts were inconsistent in just enough places to raise doubt. Was she deeply ill, or had she studied the symptoms well enough to hide behind them? In the end, the consensus leaned toward mental illness, severe, untreated, and dangerously masked behind a face of maternal devotion. Her love hadn't vanished. It had consumed her, and in the absence of support, diagnosis, or connection to reality, it had ultimately destroyed the one thing she claimed to love the most. Once the house was cleared and the investigation widened, forensic psychologists were given access to the mother's private journals, notebooks, and bedroom walls. Yes, the walls. What they found was a map of a mind unraveling in slow motion. In her room, faint pencil marks covered the wallpaper behind the dresser. At first glance, they looked like scratches, but upon closer inspection, they were words. Small, cramped, overlapping. Phrases like, "She's watching me," "They took her," and "I have to protect what's left." It wasn't graffiti. It was a ritual, a pattern of panic she returned to night after night. Notebooks found in the kitchen drawers were filled with obsessive lists. What the daughter ate, how many times she blinked during dinner, which direction her eyes moved while speaking. She was documenting behaviors, looking for signs. Signs of what no one fully understood, but to the mother, it was proof. Then came the letters. Dozens of them, addressed to no one, or perhaps to someone she feared, or worshipped, or imagined. "You can't have her." One read, "I know what you're trying to do. She's still mine." Another said simply, "If you make me choose, I will." She also wrote to her daughter, messages that blurred the line between affection and paranoia. "I love you more than life, but you've changed. Your voice isn't yours anymore. Did they touch you? Did they take something from inside you? If they did, I'll take it back. I promise." Some pages were stained, others torn. All were signs of a woman fighting invisible battles with herself, with shadows, with a world that had become unrecognizable. Investigators stood in that room, walls covered in scribbles, notebooks stacked in corners, the echo of whispered fears still lingering in the air, and realized this was not just the scene of a crime. This was the inside of her mind, projected outward, a storm she tried to contain with ink, whispers, and scribbled warnings. And when the storm grew too loud to hold in, it finally spilled over. As the investigation deepened, one detective made a quiet remark that changed the direction of the case. People don't just break overnight. There's always a fracture line if you look far enough back. So they looked. Archived medical records revealed that years before the incident, the mother had once visited an emergency room with her then-infant daughter. The report cited a minor fall. The child had a bruise on her temple. No follow-up, no suspicion. Case closed, but then came a pattern. 3 different hospitals. Over 4 years. Always minor injuries. Sprained wrist, stomach pain, low-grade fever with no medical explanation. Each time, the child was withdrawn, silent, and each time, the mother did all the talking. Teachers had filed 2 concern reports at different schools. One noted that the child often seemed anxious and fatigued. Another mentioned that she had once said, "Sometimes Mommy cries and forgets I'm there." But without concrete evidence, nothing progressed beyond documentation. Then, a buried family conflict surfaced. A cousin came forward, quiet, hesitant, but sure. She remembered visiting the home 2 years ago. She hadn't stayed long. She said the mother had been agitated that day, paranoid, suspicious, repeatedly accusing the cousin of bringing bad energy into the house. The daughter had been sent to her room. When the cousin tried to comfort her, the mother shouted, "Don't touch her. She's fragile. You'll break her." That visit was never repeated. Even more chilling was a report from a former neighbor at their previous address. She recalled hearing strange lullabies late at night, sometimes in a language she couldn't understand. One evening, she saw the child standing alone on the balcony, arms wrapped around herself. When the neighbor approached, the mother appeared within seconds, pulled the girl inside, and shut the door without a word. None of these incidents, individually, proved guilt, but together they formed a haunting mosaic. Hints and whispers of something long buried. A history not of violence, but of isolation, emotional control, subtle, invisible forms of harm. This wasn't the first time something was wrong. It was simply the first time the world couldn't look away. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, psychologists, legal experts, all drawn to a case that had become a national obsession. But despite the noise inside the courtroom, it was silence that spoke the loudest. The trial began with procedural formalities, but the tension was electric from the start. Prosecutors opened with a clear narrative: premeditation, negligence, and fatal control disguised as care. They presented the forensic findings, digital evidence, and a timeline of the mother's mental deterioration. The photographs were difficult to view. Some jurors looked away. Others sat frozen, eyes wide. Then came the cross-examination. The defense painted a very different picture. This was not a monster, they argued. This was a woman failed by every system around her, ignored by doctors, dismissed by family, unsupported by society. They didn't deny the tragedy, but they asked, was it murder or was it a complete psychological collapse? The mother sat motionless throughout, expressionless, until her own recorded statements were played aloud. The whispering, the confusion, the declarations of love laced with fear. That's when a sharp cry rang out in the courtroom from someone in the gallery. A relative, perhaps. It was quickly silenced, but the weight of it remained. The witnesses came next. A teacher, a former neighbor, a medical expert. Some offered facts. Others offered emotion. One therapist said, she didn't need punishment. She needed treatment. Years ago. But the prosecution pushed back hard. And what about the child? Who speaks for her? Who protected her when love became possession? Then the mother took the stand. The room held its breath. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She simply said, I thought I was saving her. I thought I was doing the right thing. The silence afterward was unbearable. No screams. No outrage. Just a deep, collective sense that everyone in that room had just witnessed something far more complex than guilt or innocence. It wasn't a question of what had happened anymore. It was a question of why no one saw it coming, until it was far too late. The witness stand became a stage for revelation, contradiction, and the slow unmasking of truths that had long been ignored. Each testimony peeled back another layer, not just of the crime, but the lives wrapped around it. The first to speak was a close relative, her older sister. She described a woman who had always been different, withdrawn, but never violent. She was quiet, careful. She loved that child. Almost too much. Like, she didn't know where her daughter ended and she began. Then came the child's teacher. Her voice trembled as she recalled the little girl's last parent-teacher meeting. She clung to her mother's hand the whole time. Didn't speak. Wouldn't make eye contact. I remember thinking, something's off. But how do you say that without proof? A neighbor testified next. He admitted to hearing disturbing things. The crying, the talking to herself, the odd things at night. But you don't want to accuse a mother. You don't want to believe something's wrong in the house next door. The defense called a former therapist. She had seen the mother once, years ago. She came for anxiety. We only had 2 sessions. She refused medication. She said, "If I fall apart, no one else will hold her." Her voice broke. I should have followed up. But the prosecution wasn't done. They brought in a pediatric specialist who had examined the child 6 months before her death. There were no visible signs of abuse. But emotional abuse doesn't always leave bruises. Then came the moment no one was prepared for. A letter, written by the child, found in her school desk after her death. The teacher had saved it without knowing why. It read, "Mommy says I'm special. Mommy says only she can love me right. I hope she's okay when I'm asleep. I think the dark makes her cry." The room fell into silence. Some testimonies tried to protect her. Others tried to expose her. But none could give the full truth, because the truth didn't live in any one witness. It lived in the space between what they said and what they didn't, in the hesitation before answering, in the memories reshaped by guilt, in the subtle ways people looked down when asked if they ever suspected something was wrong. They all saw something, but no one looked closely enough to name it before it was too late. The verdict was delivered in a courtroom so quiet, even the creak of a wooden bench seemed deafening. The jury had deliberated for hours, but in the end, the decision came down not to whether a crime had occurred, but how it should be understood. Guilty of manslaughter under diminished responsibility. Not murder, not an accident, but something in between. A legal recognition that while she had taken her daughter's life, her mind had not been fully hers when she did. Gasps echoed softly. Some were of outrage, others of relief. The mother showed no reaction. She stood still, her hands folded, eyes distant, as though the decision had been made in her world long before the court declared it in theirs. She was sentenced to long-term psychiatric care in a secure facility. Not a prison, but not freedom either. A place where her days would be monitored, her thoughts recorded, her treatment carefully managed. Outside, the public was divided. Some called it justice. Others called it mercy. But within the walls of that courtroom, justice had taken the only form it could, imperfect, uncertain, and deeply human. As the mother was led away, she paused once. Just before exiting, she turned slightly toward the gallery, her gaze landing on the empty seat that had been reserved for her daughter's memory. And for the first time since the trial began, her face shifted, not into sorrow, not into regret, but into something far more complex. It was the face of someone who had lost everything, including the right to understand why. In the eyes of the law, justice had been served, but in the eyes of a mother, the sentence had been handed down long before any court convened. Inside the psychiatric facility, days bled into each other like ink on wet paper. The walls were pale, the routine strict, the silence constant. She followed the schedule, woke up, ate, took her medication, attended therapy, but her presence was mechanical, like a clock ticking without a purpose. In her room, there were no personal items, no photos, no letters, only a single book of poetry left untouched on a shelf, and a window that didn't open. The staff noted she was cooperative, quiet, rarely emotional. But sometimes, late at night, a nurse would pass her door and hear her humming, soft, almost childlike. The same lullaby every time. She never asked for visitors. She never mentioned her daughter. But in therapy, fragments emerged. She spoke in metaphors, described shadows that moved, whispers that once filled her ears. And then moments of lucidity, brief, cutting, clear. "I held her too close," she said once. So close she disappeared. Some days, she would sit in the courtyard, staring at the sky without blinking. Other days, she refused to leave her room. When asked what she was thinking, she answered, "I'm walking through a graveyard, but all the names on the stones are mine." Time moved on outside. Seasons changed, people forgot, new cases took the headlines. But inside, she remained suspended in a space where memory ruled and forgiveness never arrived. She wasn't in a prison by law. She was in a prison of memory, a cell built from echoes, regret, and the unbearable weight of love twisted beyond recognition. Her punishment wasn't measured in years. It was measured in silence. Psychological experts studying the case described it not as a simple collapse of sanity, but as a slow, invisible shift, one that begins in the most sacred human emotion, love. The mother's attachment to her daughter was extreme from the beginning. It wasn't nurturing, it was possessive. She didn't see her child as a separate individual, but as an extension of herself, something to be protected at any cost. In clinical terms, it was known as enmeshed attachment, where boundaries dissolve and identity blurs. What starts as protection slowly turns into control. What begins as care becomes obsession. And when the child begins to grow, to think independently, to pull away even slightly, that feels like betrayal. This is when love turns. The same arms that once held to comfort now grip with fear. The same mind that once soothed now imagines threats in every word, every movement, every silence. The mother begins to believe she's losing the child, not to a person, but to something unseen, society, evil, fate, or her own imagined enemy. In reality, what she's losing is control. And for someone with untreated trauma, deep insecurity, or underlying mental illness, that loss can feel like annihilation. She doesn't react to the child's independence with support. She reacts with panic. And in that panic, she begins to see her child not as hers, but as something foreign, corrupted, even dangerous. That's when the shift completes. Love, no longer grounded in reality, turns inward. It becomes about preserving the idea of the child, not the child herself. And if that idea feels threatened, the mind will do anything to protect it, even destroy what's real. Psychologists don't see this as hatred. They see it as a tragic mutation of love. When trauma is left unhealed, when mental illness is untreated, when emotional dependency becomes the center of someone's identity, love loses its shape. And in some of the darkest cases, it becomes indistinguishable from violence. This case leaves behind more than court records and psychological reports. It leaves behind a question that every listener must carry. What happens when emotion, unchecked and unbalanced, is allowed to govern without reason? Love is powerful. It heals, protects, builds. But when it loses its anchor, when it becomes possessive, obsessive, or rooted in unresolved pain, it can also destroy. The mother in this story didn't wake up evil. She wasn't born a threat. She was a person shaped by trauma, isolation, and silence. And when she loved without boundaries, without help, without pause. But even the purest emotions need limits. Compassion without clarity becomes enablement. Protection without perspective becomes suffocation. Love without truth can become a weapon. This tragedy wasn't just the result of one woman's unraveling. It was the product of society that doesn't listen until it's too late. A system that overlooks silent suffering. A culture that labels mothers as either perfect or monsters, with no room for the broken human in between. When emotions rise unchecked, when pain goes unheard, when support never arrives, the end is rarely loud. It's quiet, subtle, hidden behind smiles and routines. Until one day, everything breaks. The real lesson isn't just to see the signs in others, but to recognize them in ourselves, to ask harder questions, to reach out earlier, to understand that love alone isn't enough if it's fueled by fear. Because when emotion crosses a line and no one draws it back, the cost isn't just one life. It's everyone left behind, trying to understand how love became a tragedy. Now it's your turn. After everything you've heard, every whisper, every scream, every unanswered question, what do you believe? Was this love in its most broken form? Or was it madness disguised as devotion? Was she a mother trying to protect her child from a world she couldn't trust? Or a woman lost in a world she couldn't escape? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Was this love? Or was it something far more dangerous? If this story moved you, disturbed you, or made you see the human mind in a new light, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss what comes next. And tell us, what should we investigate next? Your story might be the next one we uncover.